let's put the first piece on our template and then sew the seam between 1 and 2. So as you can see, I have my pre-cut E1 piece of fabric and my E2 piece of fabric. And this is the seam we're going to sew over here between E1 and E2. So what we're going to do, let's move those guys out the way, is we're just going to take our add a quarter ruler, and you're going to put the skinny side of the add a quarter ruler onto the seam line over here. And you line it up, and then you hold that down with your one hand, and you just fold against it and finger press it. So you have a nice fold line. But in order to position this fabric in place so that we have seam allowance all around, I need to know where these other lines are too. So I'm actually going to fold all the lines around E1. Now you can use a light box to position these, but I'm going to assume, for the sake of this exercise, that you guys don't have a light box. So we're going to use the folding technique. So as you can see now, here is your E1, and you can see now the lines show me where that is. So I'm going to position my fabric right side down, and I'm going to put a little bit of glue. Now we don't need a lot of glue, we just need enough to hold it in place. And I'm going to position it so that I can see, I know I have a little bit extra, so you can see here where the seam's going to go. I'm going to position it so that I have at least 1/4 of an inch here on this side of the seam, 1/4 of an inch on this side of the seam, and at least 1/4 of an inch on that side of the seam. So that's why we need to have those folds in place. So that way we know that we're covered. So now we have our block in place, but we need to work out this seam allowance here between E1 and E2. So for that, we're going to go back to this piece. We're going to fold it over on the line that's between 1 and 2. And this is upside down now, I could do it this way. Between 1 and E2, we're going to fold it that way. And we're just going to trim this to 1/4 inch exactly. So I'll just turn that, and then you put the ridge side of the ruler. You can see that little 1/4 inch ridge, and that sits on this fold that you have here. So you just pop it on like that, and then you just slice off whatever is extra. So you have your seam allowance perfectly at 1/4 now. It's a really clever invention, this. And then you take your second piece, and you're going to place it right side down, so your fabrics are right side together. It's just like regular quilting in that way, that your fabrics go right side together, and you're lining up this edge here so that you know that when you sew the seam, that as you sew it, you'll have a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance because you've already cut it. So then you take that carefully to your sewing machine table without moving it, and we're going to stitch this seam here. And we're going to back stitch in the seam allowance here, and then go along and then back stitch over here. The reason that you're back stitching is so that when you remove the paper later on, you're not going to pull your stitches out. Okay, so we're going to stitch along the line between 1 and 2, trying to stay on the line. Our stitch length is set to about just under 2 or 1.8, and we're going to back stitch in the seam allowance area. And when you get to the line where the next seam is met, you stop on the line or just right at it and back up a few stitches. Great. Now we've stitched that seam line, and when you turn it over, you can see that if you fold your fabric back over, and we can just finger press it here or use our seam ruler, you've done 1 to 2. And as you can see now, as long as your letters on your template are reading right ways up, when you turn it over, your E is going to read right way because the side of the E is here, and it's going to read this way. Let's do the piece between 2 and 3 now, just to double down on that technique for you. Okay, so we've done 1 to 2. If we switch it over, we're now going to fold on the line between 2 and 3. It's the same as what we did before. We're just trying to work out our seam allowance. But we don't need to fold the other ones now because this side seam down here is already folded, and we will just use that to guide us as to how far over to place this piece of fabric for number 3. So here is my pre-cut for number 3. And once again, we're going to sew right sides together. So I'm going to turn it upside down. To find the location this way, we need to understand how far along left to right. So we know that this side has a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but on this side we need to add it. So what I usually do is I usually trim after each piece, so that helps us to figure out the left and right side. So I'm just going to trim that excess off there. So now when I turn it over, you can see I know exactly, because that's the end of the seam allowance there, and here's the end of the seam allowance here. So if I place it there, I'll have that one will be exactly, and that one will be a little bit over. So I'll just center it a little bit over, like that, and that gives me a little bit of play on either side. And now I'm going to go and stitch that one. Okay, so as you can see, we've brought it over here without moving it, and if I fold it back over, I have my seam allowances lined up nicely, and the underneath piece is going over this edge of the seam allowance, and it's going over past this edge of the seam allowance, if you have a look there. So I know I'm going to have enough on either side. So I just slide it under, and now we're going to start a little bit before, so that we can back into that corner and then drive forward, or stitch forward, and then we're going to back stitch again in the seam allowance area. So I'm just going to show you that I've got a little bit of space. You only need enough for about three stitches or so to back stitch. It's just to stop your seams coming undone when you remove your paper later. So I stop on that line where the next seam is. And go along, and then back it up. So there you go. You can see our E is starting to come along, and we've got the third piece in place.